Good evening. Tonight we begin with something far more insidious than the usual tales of corporate success and American ingenuity. This is the complete history of Coca-Cola, the beverage that started as a cocaine-laced patent medicine in a Confederate veteran's backyard and became the most recognized brand in human history. Forget the heartwarming Christmas commercials, the polar bears, the carefully crafted image of happiness in a bottle. The real story is far darker, far more complex, and far more revealing about capitalism, addiction, and the power of branding than any marketing campaign could ever admit. This is a tale that spans continents and centuries, from the coca fields of Peru, where indigenous people chewed the sacred leaf for millennia, to a desperate pharmacist's laboratory in Atlanta, where morphine addiction drove innovation. From the patent medicine era when cocaine was prescribed for everything from toothaches to depression, to the backroom deals that transformed a local soda fountain drink into a global empire worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It's a story of brilliant marketing and ruthless business practices, of secret formulas and Supreme Court cases, of racial exploitation in sugar plantations, and sophisticated psychological manipulation of entire populations. The truth is, if you were dropped into any chapter of this company's rise, whether in an 1880s pharmacy, where cocaine was sold over the counter as medicine, in a southern bottling plant during Jim Crow, where black workers were systematically exploited, or in a modern boardroom, where the company's water usage is devastating communities in India and Mexico, you would quickly see how thin the line is between legitimate business and legalized addiction, between corporate success and social harm, between marketing genius and mass manipulation. You would see how a drink created by a morphine addict using another addictive substance became the template for modern consumer capitalism. You would see how prohibition and regulation, rather than destroying the company, only made it more powerful by forcing it to innovate and adapt. You would see how the removal of cocaine from the formula didn't end the addiction, it just shifted it to sugar and caffeine, and most powerfully to the brand itself. You would see how Coca-Cola didn't just sell a beverage, it sold an idea, an identity, a way of life that hundreds of millions of people around the world have literally bought into. Before we begin this journey through pharmacy counters and bottling plants, through courtrooms and advertising agencies, through war zones and corporate boardrooms, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely find value in what we explore here. And please, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what beverage you're drinking while you watch this. I'm always fascinated by the global reach of these stories, by the fact that Coca-Cola is available in every country on Earth except North Korea and Cuba, that more people recognize the Coca-Cola logo than recognize the Christian cross. Now, settle in, perhaps with a cold drink of your own, and prepare yourself. This is not the story Coca-Cola tells about itself. This is not a celebration of American entrepreneurship, or a testament to the power of positive thinking. This is a history that asks uncomfortable questions about addiction, exploitation, environmental destruction, and the construction of desire itself. This is the story of how a cocaine-laced patent medicine became the most successful product in the history of capitalism, and what that success reveals about all of us. Let's step into this complex, troubling, and ultimately very American story together. The story begins not in Atlanta, not in America, not even in the 19th century, but in the high Andes Mountains of South America, where for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, indigenous peoples had cultivated and revered a plant they called coca. Not coconut, not cocoa, but coca, Erythroxylum coca, a shrubby plant with small oval leaves that, when chewed, produced remarkable effects. The Inca called it the divine plant, a gift from the sun god, Inti, and they were not wrong to consider it extraordinary. When you chewed coca leaves, slowly, mixing them with a bit of alkaline substance like lime or ash to release the active compounds, something remarkable happened. The exhaustion of walking mountain paths at high altitude would fade, hunger would recede into the background, the thin air would seem less thin, your mind would sharpen, and your body would find reserves of energy you didn't know you possessed. For people living at elevations where simply breathing was work, where food was often scarce and labor was constant, coca was not merely a pleasant indulgence, it was a survival tool, a medicine, a sacrament. The Spanish conquistadors, when they arrived in the 16th century, initially tried to suppress coca use among the indigenous population. The Catholic Church declared it a tool of the devil, an obstacle to Christian conversion. But the Spanish quickly discovered a problem: indigenous workers in the silver mines, working in conditions of unimaginable brutality, could work longer and harder if they were given coca leaves. The contradiction was resolved in favor of profit. Coca was declared acceptable, even encouraged, because it made exploitation more efficient. The indigenous population was enslaved, forced to work themselves to death in the mines, and given coca to help them endure the unendurable. This pattern, using a stimulant to extract more labor from exploited workers, would repeat throughout the history of cocaine and Coca-Cola. For centuries, coca remained largely confined to South America. Europeans knew about it. They had read the Spanish accounts, but the leaves didn't travel well. By the time dried coca leaves reached Europe, weeks or months after harvest, much of the active alkaloid had degraded. The effects were weak and unreliable. Coca was a curiosity, not a commodity. But in 1855, a German chemist named Friedrich Geydig achieved something that would change everything. He isolated the active principle of coca, the specific chemical compound responsible for its effects, and he created a pure crystalline powder. He called it erythroxyline. 4 years later, another German chemist, Albert Niemann, improved the process and renamed the compound. He called it cocaine. For the first time in human history, the essence of coca could be extracted, purified, transported, and administered in precise doses. Cocaine could be dissolved in water or alcohol, injected with a syringe, applied topically, mixed into medicines. The limitations that had kept coca confined to the Andes were suddenly gone. The global cocaine trade was about to begin. The medical establishment embraced cocaine with extraordinary enthusiasm. Here was a substance that seemed almost miraculous. It provided energy and suppressed appetite, making it perfect for weight loss. It numbed pain and constricted blood vessels, making it an ideal local anesthetic for surgery. It elevated mood and increased confidence, making it a treatment for depression and anxiety. It seemed to cure morphine addiction, which was reaching epidemic levels in the United States following the Civil War when thousands of wounded soldiers had been treated with morphine and left addicted. Cocaine was prescribed for everything from hay fever to seasickness, from asthma to alcoholism. It was mixed into tonics, lozenges, nasal sprays, and hemorrhoid ointments. It was given to children for toothaches. It was sold over the counter in any pharmacy, no questions asked. This was the world that John Pemberton entered when he began experimenting with coca-based medicines in Columbus, Georgia, in the early 1880s. Pemberton was a pharmacist, trained in the botanical medicine tradition, a maker of patent medicines in an era when patent medicines were a massive industry built on exaggerated claims, secret formulas, and active ingredients that often included cocaine, morphine, alcohol, or all three. He was also, by this point in his life, a morphine addict. Pemberton had served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. In April 1865, in one of the last cavalry battles of the war, he was wounded by a saber slash across the chest. The wound was treated with morphine, as were most serious injuries in that era, and Pemberton, like so many Civil War veterans, became dependent on the drug. For the rest of his life, he would struggle with morphine addiction, and it was this struggle that drove much of his pharmaceutical experimentation. He was searching for a cure for his own condition, a medicine that would free him from morphine without leaving him in agony. Coca seemed like the answer. The medical literature said it cured morphine addiction. It provided energy and mental clarity, without the dreamy stupor of morphine, and conveniently, for a pharmacist looking to develop commercial products, it was perfectly legal and socially acceptable. Pemberton began incorporating coca into his patent medicines. He created a beverage he called Pemberton's French wine coca, inspired by a popular European product called Vin Mariani, a wine infused with coca extract that was being marketed as a tonic and consumed by everyone from Pope Leo XIII to Thomas Edison, from Jules Verne to Ulysses S. Grant. Pemberton's wine coca was a success, at least locally. It was sold in pharmacies and advertised as a cure for nervous disorders, headaches, neuralgia, hysteria, and melancholy. But in 1886, Pemberton faced a crisis. Fulton County, where Atlanta was located, passed prohibition legislation. Alcohol, the base of his wine coca, was about to become illegal. He needed to reformulate his product as a non-alcoholic beverage if he wanted to keep selling it. This was the moment of Coca-Cola's creation, though Pemberton didn't know he was creating anything historically significant. He was just trying to save his business and fund his morphine habit. He took his wine coca formula and removed the alcohol. He added extracts of kola nut, a West African plant that contained caffeine and had its own stimulant properties. He added sugar syrup to make it palatable. He added various flavoring oils, vanilla, cinnamon, citrus, creating a complex taste that would become instantly recognizable to billions of people. And crucially, he retained the coca leaf extract, which meant the drink contained cocaine. The exact amount of cocaine in early Coca-Cola is disputed and probably varied from batch to batch, but the best historical evidence suggests it was somewhere between 9 milligrams and 18 milligrams per serving. That's not a huge amount, especially compared to the cocaine doses being prescribed medically, which could be hundreds of milligrams. But it was enough to be psychoactive, enough to be noticeable, enough to make people want to come back for another glass. Pemberton mixed his first batch of Coca-Cola syrup in a brass kettle in his backyard. He carried a jug of it to Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta, one of the soda fountains where carbonated beverages were mixed and served. The pharmacist there added carbonated water to the syrup and served it to customers for 5 cents a glass. One of Pemberton's business partners, Frank Robinson, came up with the name Coca-Cola, thinking that the two C's would look good in advertising. Robinson also designed the distinctive flowing script logo that, with minor modifications, is still used today. It was May 1886, and the most valuable brand in human history had just been born. But John Pemberton would not live to see its success. He was dying, worn out by age, morphine addiction, and stomach cancer. He needed money, and he began selling shares in his formula to various business partners. By the time he died in August 1888, at age 57, ownership of Coca-Cola was fragmented among several people, and the company was barely profitable. It might have disappeared entirely, just another forgotten patent medicine from an era of wild medical claims and dubious elixirs. But it didn't disappear, because one of the men who had bought shares in Pemberton's formula was a businessman who understood something that Pemberton never had: the power of marketing, the importance of control, and the vast profit potential of selling addiction in a bottle. His name was Asa Griggs Candler, and he was about to build an empire. Asa Candler was not a pharmacist or a physician or a scientist. He was a businessman. Born in rural Georgia, raised in a strict Methodist household, trained in the stern principles of hard work and profit maximization. He had started as a pharmacy clerk and worked his way up to owning his own drugstore in Atlanta. When he first tasted Coca-Cola at Jacob's Pharmacy, he saw something that others had missed. He saw a product with addictive properties, with a distinctive taste, with a memorable name, and with almost no competition in its category. He saw, in other words, an opportunity. Between 1888 and 1891, Candler systematically acquired all rights to Coca-Cola, buying out Pemberton's various partners through a combination of cash payments and legal maneuvering. The exact details are murky. Some of the deals were conducted in ways that might charitably be called aggressive, but by 1891, Candler had complete control of the Coca-Cola formula and trademark. He incorporated the Coca-Cola Company in 1892 with an initial capital of $100,000, and he set about turning a local soda fountain drink into a national brand. Candler's genius lay in marketing, and his marketing strategy was revolutionary for its time. First, he made Coca-Cola ubiquitous. He sent salesmen throughout the South with free sample coupons, giving people their first taste at no cost. He understood intuitively what we now know scientifically: the first hit is free, and once people have tried your product, especially if it contains mildly addictive substances, they'll come back and pay for it. He spent lavishly on advertising, an unheard-of practice for a beverage company. In 1895 alone, Coca-Cola spent more than $11,000 on advertising, a massive sum when the average American worker earned perhaps $400 per year. The advertising was everywhere, and it was relentless. Coca-Cola ads appeared in newspapers, on billboards, on the sides of buildings. The company distributed promotional items with the Coca-Cola logo, calendars, serving trays, clocks, thermometers, pencils, matches, playing cards. If you lived in an American town or city in the 1890s, you could not escape Coca-Cola's presence. The red logo became one of the most recognizable images in American life, second only perhaps to the American flag itself. But Candler did more than just advertise. He created a mythology around the product. Coca-Cola wasn't just a beverage, it was medicine. The company's early advertising claimed that Coca-Cola cured headaches, relieved exhaustion, cured morphine and opium habits, and was a valuable brain tonic and a cure for all nervous affections. These weren't casual suggestions, they were explicit medical claims, printed in newspapers and on promotional materials, endorsed implicitly by pharmacists who sold the drink alongside legitimate medicines. The formula itself became shrouded in mystery. Candler kept the exact recipe secret, known only to a handful of people, stored in a vault that became the stuff of legend. This secrecy served multiple purposes. It protected the formula from competitors, certainly, but it also created mystique. The secret formula became part of Coca-Cola's brand identity, suggesting that there was something special, something almost magical about the drink that couldn't be replicated. Even today, more than a century later, the Coca-Cola company maintains the fiction that only 2 people alive know the complete formula, though this is almost certainly corporate mythology rather than fact. What Candler didn't advertise, what he carefully avoided mentioning, was the cocaine content. Not because he was ashamed of it. Cocaine was perfectly legal and socially acceptable in the 1890s, but because he understood that the less customers thought about the ingredients, the more they could project their own desires and needs onto the product. Coca-Cola could be whatever you wanted it to be: a refreshing drink, a medical tonic, a pick-me-up, a treat. The ambiguity was profitable. The company's growth in the 1890s was explosive. In 1888, the year Candler began acquiring rights to the formula, Coca-Cola sold about 9,000 gallons of syrup, enough for perhaps 50,000 servings. By 1895, the company was selling in every state in the Union. By 1900, annual sales exceeded 1 million gallons of syrup, representing tens of millions of individual servings. The soda fountain business, centered in pharmacies, was the primary distribution channel. People would visit their local pharmacy, sit at the marble counter, and order a Coca-Cola mixed fresh by the pharmacist or soda jerk. 5 cents for a glass of dark, sweet, fizzy medicine, not medicine, that tasted like nothing else, and left you wanting more. But Candler made a decision in these early years that would prove to be one of the most consequential business decisions in corporate history, though at the time it seemed like a minor concession. In 1899, 2 businessmen from Chattanooga, Tennessee, Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead, approached Candler with a proposal. They wanted to bottle Coca-Cola, to sell it in glass bottles that people could take home or consume away from soda fountains. Candler was skeptical. He saw bottling as a distraction from the core soda fountain business. The machinery required was expensive, bottles could break, and distribution would be complicated. But Thomas and Whitehead were persistent, and Candler eventually agreed to license them the bottling rights for most of the United States for the nominal sum of $1. It was possibly the worst business deal in the history of capitalism, at least from Coca-Cola's perspective. Candler gave away the bottling rights in perpetuity, with no provision for the company to buy them back, for essentially nothing. The bottlers would buy syrup from Coca-Cola at a fixed price, and then bottle and sell the finished product, keeping most of the profit. Candler thought he was getting rid of a headache. What he actually did was create a system where independent bottlers, not the parent company, would control most of Coca-Cola's distribution and profit from its growth. This arrangement would last for decades, and would eventually lead to complex legal battles when the company tried to regain control. But in 1899, it seemed unimportant. Bottles were a curiosity. The real business was soda fountains. The early 1900s brought new challenges. The temperance movement, which had been growing in power throughout the late 19th century, began to turn its attention to patent medicines and soft drinks. Temperance advocates had successfully pushed for alcohol prohibition in many counties and states, and now they were looking at other substances that produced intoxication or dependence. Cocaine, which had been seen as a miracle drug in the 1880s, was increasingly being viewed as dangerous, particularly when used by populations that white society feared. The racial dimension of the anti-cocaine panic cannot be ignored. Newspaper articles and political speeches in the early 1900s were filled with lurid stories about cocaine-crazed Negroes attacking white people, about cocaine giving black men superhuman strength and immunity to bullets, about cocaine fueling black criminality. These stories were almost entirely fabricated, racist propaganda designed to justify increased policing and violence against black communities, but they were effective at creating public hysteria about cocaine. Southern states began passing laws restricting cocaine sales, and pressure mounted on manufacturers to remove cocaine from their products. Candler faced a dilemma. Cocaine was probably responsible for some of Coca-Cola's appeal, that little kick that brought people back for another glass. But cocaine was becoming politically toxic, associated in the public mind with crime, addiction, and racial fears. Candler was a shrewd businessman, and a careful observer of social trends. He recognized that cocaine, while currently legal, was unlikely to remain so, and he recognized that Coca-Cola's association with cocaine, even though the amount in the drink was small, could become a liability. So Candler made a decision that would shape Coca-Cola's future. He would remove the cocaine, but he would do it quietly, gradually, without announcing it, and he would continue to use coca leaf extract, processed to remove most or all of the cocaine, so he could still claim that the drink contained coca. The name Coca-Cola would remain accurate, technically, but the cocaine would be gone. The process of decocainizing Coca-Cola took several years and involved considerable chemical sophistication. The company contracted with a pharmaceutical company, Maywood Chemical Works in New Jersey, to process the coca leaves. The leaves were treated with various solvents to extract the cocaine alkaloids, which were then sold to pharmaceutical companies for legitimate medical use, particularly as a local anesthetic. What remained was spent coca leaf, still containing the flavoring compounds that gave Coca-Cola its distinctive taste but essentially free of cocaine. This spent coca leaf extract was shipped to Atlanta and added to the Coca-Cola formula. By 1903, Coca-Cola was advertising itself as the drink that makes a pause refreshing, subtly shifting away from medical claims toward lifestyle branding. The cocaine content had been reduced to trace amounts, probably less than 1/10 of what it had been in the 1890s. By 1929, the process was so refined that cocaine was undetectable in Coca-Cola by any analytical method available at the time. The drink was, for all practical purposes, cocaine-free. But the name remained, and the mystique remained, and sales continued to grow exponentially. What replaced cocaine as Coca-Cola's hook? Several things. First, caffeine. Cola nut extract provided significant caffeine, and Candler made sure the caffeine levels remained high, typically 60–70 milligrams per serving, comparable to a cup of coffee. Caffeine is of course addictive, though much less dramatically so than cocaine. Regular Coca-Cola drinkers would experience mild withdrawal headaches if they stopped, providing a subtle incentive to keep drinking. Second, sugar. Early Coca-Cola contained enormous amounts of sugar, nearly 40 grams per serving, providing an immediate rush of energy and pleasure. Sugar activates the same reward pathways in the brain as drugs like cocaine, though again, much less intensely. The combination of sugar and caffeine created a milder but still real chemical hook. But most importantly, what replaced cocaine was brand loyalty itself. By 1903, millions of Americans had formed a habit of drinking Coca-Cola. It was woven into their daily routines, their social rituals, their sense of identity. The drink had become associated with pleasure, refreshment, sociability, Americanness itself. People drank Coca-Cola not because they needed cocaine, but because they had been conditioned, through years of advertising and consumption, to associate Coca-Cola with positive feelings. The addiction had shifted from chemical to psychological, from cocaine to brand. This transition, from selling a drink that contained an addictive drug to selling a brand that people were addicted to, was perhaps Candler's greatest achievement. He had created something that would long outlast cocaine's presence in the formula. He had created desire itself, bottled and trademarked. The cocaine panic, and the government's war, race politics, and the formula change. The relationship between Coca-Cola and the United States government in the early 20th century was complex, combative, and deeply revealing about the nature of regulation, corporate power, and the malleability of law itself. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 marked a watershed moment in American regulatory history, the first significant federal legislation to address the chaos of patent medicines, adulterated foods, and fraudulent health claims that characterized the late 19th century. The law required that manufacturers list certain dangerous ingredients on their labels, and it empowered the government to seize products that were misbranded or adulterated. Harvey Washington Wiley, the chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture, and the driving force behind the Pure Food and Drug Act, saw Coca-Cola as a prime target for enforcement. Wiley was a crusader, a true believer in the power of science to protect public health, and he was deeply suspicious of patent medicines and soft drinks that contained stimulants. He believed that Coca-Cola was dangerous, that it contained harmful amounts of caffeine, and that it was fraudulently marketed because the name suggested it contained cocaine, when it no longer did, or alternatively, that it was dangerous because it still contained cocaine, depending on which argument suited his purposes at any given moment. In 1909, the government made its move. Federal agents seized 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola syrup at the company's Chattanooga bottling plant. The official charge was that Coca-Cola was adulterated because it contained an added poisonous ingredient, caffeine. and that it was misbranded because the name Coca-Cola suggested the presence of coca and cola, implying specific ingredients and effects. The case, formerly titled United States 40 Barrels and 20 Kegs of Coca-Cola, went to trial in 1911 in Chattanooga. The trial was extraordinary, a circus of scientific experts, competing analyses, and deeply dubious claims on both sides. The government brought in witnesses to testify about caffeine's harmful effects. They presented studies, many of them poorly designed or outright fabricated, claiming that caffeine caused insomnia, heart palpitations, nervous disorders, and moral degradation. They brought in a researcher who claimed to have given Coca-Cola to rabbits, and observed that the rabbits became aggressive and died, though on cross-examination it emerged that he had force-fed the rabbits quantities of Coca-Cola equivalent to a human drinking 50 bottles per day. The government's case relied heavily on the claim that caffeine, because it was added to the drink rather than occurring naturally in the ingredients, constituted an adulterated product under the law. This was a legally creative argument. Tea and coffee naturally contained caffeine, and no one was suggesting they should be banned. But Coca-Cola, the government argued, had caffeine added to it from cola nut extract, and that addition made it dangerous and illegal. Coca-Cola's defense was equally creative. The company's lawyers argued that caffeine was not added, but was a natural component of the cola nut extract, and therefore Coca-Cola was no different from tea or coffee. They brought in their own parade of expert witnesses who testified that caffeine in moderate amounts was harmless, that Coca-Cola actually contained less caffeine than coffee, and that the government's studies were methodologically flawed. They emphasized that Coca-Cola no longer contained significant cocaine, positioning the company as responsible corporate citizens who had voluntarily removed a problematic ingredient. The racial subtext of the trial was never far from the surface. Though the government's case officially focused on caffeine, the publicity around the trial and the newspaper coverage repeatedly mentioned cocaine, and frequently deployed racist imagery about black Americans and drug use. The government wanted the public to associate Coca-Cola with cocaine, and they wanted to associate cocaine with black criminality, even though by 1911, Coca-Cola contained virtually no cocaine. The strategy was to create guilt by association, to taint Coca-Cola with the racist panic about cocaine that was sweeping the country. This racist panic was not accidental or spontaneous. It was deliberately manufactured by newspapers, politicians, and law enforcement agencies to justify increased control over black populations in the post-Reconstruction South. Newspapers published sensationalized stories, many completely fabricated, about black men using cocaine and then attacking white women. Police chiefs testified before legislative committees that cocaine made black men immune to bullets, requiring the use of larger caliber weapons. Physicians who should have known better wrote articles claiming that cocaine gave black men superhuman strength and eliminated their natural fear of white authority. The most pernicious aspect of this propaganda was the way it inverted cause and effect. Black Americans in the early 20th century lived under a system of violent oppression, constant threat, economic exploitation, and legal discrimination. Some turned to drugs, including cocaine, as a way to cope with unbearable circumstances, just as people in every oppressed population throughout history have sought chemical escape. But the racist narrative portrayed cocaine use as causing black criminality and violence, rather than recognizing both as symptoms of a brutal social system. The drug became the excuse for violence that was going to happen anyway, for lynchings and police brutality that needed no excuse beyond the color of a person's skin. Coca-Cola, as a Southern company run by white Southerners who shared the racial attitudes of their time and place, understood this panic and used it strategically. When it served the company's purposes to distance themselves from cocaine, they emphasized that the drug was associated with crime and vice, implicitly with black crime and black vice. When it served their purposes to defend caffeine, they compared Coca-Cola to coffee and tea, respectable beverages consumed by respectable white people. The company's position on cocaine was always about protecting profits and market position, never about any consistent principle of public health or social responsibility. The jury, after hearing weeks of testimony and deliberating for just a few hours, found in favor of Coca-Cola. The judge ruled that the government had failed to prove that caffeine in the amounts present in Coca-Cola was harmful, and he rejected the government's argument about added versus natural ingredients. It was a complete victory for the company, but the government appealed, and the case wound its way through the courts for years. In 1916, the Supreme Court heard the case. The justices, in a decision that revealed more about judicial philosophy than about science or public health, overturned the lower court's verdict on technical grounds. They ruled that the question of whether caffeine was an added ingredient or a natural component needed to be re-examined. The case was sent back for a new trial, but by this point, both sides were exhausted. The government had spent years and enormous resources on a case that was always more about making a public example than about protecting public health. Coca-Cola had spent a fortune on legal fees and had suffered years of negative publicity. In 1918, the two sides reached a settlement. Coca-Cola agreed to reduce the caffeine content in its product by about 30%, to pay court costs, and to make no therapeutic claims in its advertising. The government agreed to drop the case. Neither side won, exactly, but Coca-Cola certainly lost less. The company emerged from the ordeal with its product essentially unchanged, its market position strengthened by the years of free publicity, and its reputation as an American institution secured. The government's attempt to regulate Coca-Cola had failed, and it would be decades before federal authorities seriously challenged the soft drink industry again. But the caffeine case was not the only legal battle Coca-Cola fought in this era. The company was also engaged in a long struggle over the trademark itself, over who had the right to use the name Coca-Cola, and what that name meant. This fight was about more than just brand protection. It was about defining the product's identity and controlling its image in the public mind. The problem was that in the early years when the bottling rights had been sold for $1, Asa Candler had not been careful about protecting the trademark. Multiple companies had sprung up selling products with similar names: Coca-Nola, Mar Coca-Co, Toca-Cola, Coca, and dozens of others. These imitators were not subtle. They used similar scripts, similar bottle shapes, similar advertising, deliberately trying to confuse consumers into thinking they were buying the real thing. Some of these imitations were simply cheaper versions of cola-flavored soda. Others actually contained cocaine in higher concentrations than Coca-Cola itself, trading on the name's association with Coca while delivering a more potent drug. Coca-Cola sued relentlessly. The company filed hundreds of trademark infringement cases in the 1910s and 1920s, taking on imitators large and small. Most of these cases were won through sheer financial attrition. Coca-Cola could afford to keep fighting while smaller companies could not. But some went to trial and produced important legal precedents about trademark law, about what constituted infringement, about the degree to which a name could be protected when that name referenced ingredients that were no longer substantially present in the product. The most significant of these cases reached the Supreme Court in 1920. The Coca Company of America had been selling a beverage called Coca, arguing that the name was simply a shortened version of cola, and that they had as much right to use it as anyone else. Coca-Cola argued that Coca was obviously intended to trade on Coca-Cola's reputation, that consumers were being deliberately confused, and that this confusion constituted trademark infringement. The case hinged on a strange question: could Coca-Cola claim trademark protection for a name that referenced cocaine, when the product no longer contained cocaine? Was the name itself a form of fraud? Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing for the majority, ruled in Coca-Cola's favor, but his opinion was scathing. He acknowledged that the name Coca-Cola was a representation that the drink contained coca and cola, and he noted that this representation was no longer entirely true since the cocaine had been removed. He wrote that Coca-Cola had been built on a falsehood, that the original success of the drink was probably due to cocaine's presence, and that the company had profited enormously from selling what was essentially a drug. But Holmes continued, the name had acquired such strong association in the public mind, that it now meant the specific product made by the Coca-Cola Company, regardless of its ingredients. The name had transcended its literal meaning, and become a brand. Therefore, it deserved protection from imitators. It was a remarkable piece of legal reasoning, simultaneously condemning Coca-Cola for its history and protecting its future. Holmes was saying, in effect, yes, you built your company on cocaine, yes, your name is technically fraudulent, but you've been doing it so successfully for so long that you now own the name regardless of what it literally means. The decision established important principles about trademark law and brand identity, principles that would shape corporate law for the next century. But it also revealed something about power and law itself. If you become big enough, successful enough, embedded enough in the culture, the law will bend to accommodate you, will forgive your origins, will protect your interests, because you have become in some sense too big to challenge. The legal victory over Coca was followed by dozens of similar victories over other imitators. Coca-Cola's trademark lawyers became legendary for their aggressiveness and their success rate. the company developed a reputation for protecting its name with almost fanatical intensity, going after not just obvious imitators but anyone who used the word cola in ways that might create confusion. This aggressive trademark protection served multiple purposes. It eliminated competition, obviously, but it also reinforced in the public mind that there was only one real Coca-Cola, that imitations were inherently inferior, that the authentic product was worth seeking out and paying more for. While Coca-Cola was fighting these legal battles, the social context around cocaine was shifting dramatically. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 effectively criminalized non-medical cocaine use in the United States, placing it under strict federal control. The act was framed as a tax measure, technically requiring registration and payment of taxes for cocaine transactions, but in practice it functioned as prohibition. Doctors could prescribe cocaine for medical purposes, but recreational use became a federal crime. State laws were even more restrictive, with many southern states completely banning cocaine sales regardless of medical necessity. The Harrison Act was passed during a period of intense progressive-era reform, when the federal government was expanding its regulatory power into areas previously left to states or to individual choice. But the specific focus on cocaine, and the timing of the legislation, cannot be separated from the racist panic that had been building for years. The same newspapers that had published fabricated stories about cocaine-crazed black men now praised the Harrison Act as necessary to protect white society. Law enforcement officials who had used cocaine as an excuse for brutal policing of black communities now had federal backing for their actions. For Coca-Cola, this transition was almost perfectly timed. By 1914, the company had already removed virtually all cocaine from the formula. When cocaine was banned, Coca-Cola could position itself as a responsible company that had anticipated public health concerns, that had voluntarily cleaned up its product before being forced to. The company's public statements emphasized that Coca-Cola had never contained dangerous amounts of cocaine, that the removal had been done out of an abundance of caution, and that the drink had always been primarily about refreshment rather than medication. The cocaine era became a distant, slightly embarrassing part of the company's history, mentioned occasionally, but quickly glossed over, certainly not something to be advertised. What's fascinating is how completely this history was forgotten or suppressed. By the 1920s, Coca-Cola advertising never mentioned cocaine, never referenced the drink's origins as a patent medicine, never acknowledged that the name itself referred to an ingredient that had been present and was now absent. The company's official histories, when they mentioned the early years at all, portrayed John Pemberton as a benevolent inventor who created a refreshing beverage, with perhaps a vague mention that early formulas included various botanical extracts. The cocaine connection was erased as thoroughly as the cocaine itself had been removed from the drink. This erasure was helped by the fact that the early consumers, the people who had actually drunk cocaine-containing Coca-Cola in the 1890s and early 1900s, were aging and dying. Their memories were fading, and younger people who heard their stories about the old days probably dismissed them as exaggerations or confusions. The new generation of Coca-Cola drinkers, the young people of the 1920s and 1930s, had no personal experience with the cocaine era. For them, Coca-Cola was just Coca-Cola, a familiar taste, an American tradition, something that had always existed in its current form. The history was lost, not through any dramatic suppression but simply through the passage of time and the company's decision not to remind people of what had been. But the coca leaf, and through it a thin thread connecting Coca-Cola to cocaine, never entirely disappeared. The company continued, and continues to this day, to use coca leaf extract in its formula. The leaves are imported from Peru, where coca cultivation is legal for export to pharmaceutical and flavoring companies. They are processed by a single company in New Jersey, Stepan Company, which has held the exclusive U.S. license to import and process coca leaves since the 1920s. The Stepan Company extracts the cocaine, which is sold to pharmaceutical companies for use as a topical anesthetic, particularly in eye, nose, and throat surgeries, where its numbing and vasoconstricting properties remain medically valuable, and sells the decocainized extract to Coca-Cola for flavoring. This arrangement is legal, approved by the Drug Enforcement Administration, and highly confidential. The exact amount of coca leaf used, currently estimated at around 100 metric tons per year imported from Peru, the precise method of processing, the degree to which cocaine is present in trace amounts in the finished Coca-Cola product, all of this is proprietary information that neither Stepan nor Coca-Cola will discuss publicly. The Stepan facility in Maywood, New Jersey, is one of the most secure pharmaceutical plants in America, surrounded by fencing and security measures appropriate to a facility that handles significant quantities of cocaine precursor material. But the basic fact remains: Coca-Cola still contains coca, even if it doesn't contain cocaine. The name is still accurate, technically, legally, in a way that satisfies both trademark law and the company's desire to maintain continuity with its history. Why does Coca-Cola continue to use coca leaf extract when the cocaine is gone, and the flavor contribution is probably minimal, and could almost certainly be replicated synthetically? The cynical answer is that it allows the company to continue using the name Coca-Cola without any risk of trademark challenges based on false advertising. If the drink contained no coca at all, competitors or regulators could argue that the name is misleading, that it promises an ingredient that isn't present. By maintaining even a decocainized trace of coca, the company can claim the name is literally accurate. The romantic answer is that it maintains a link to the original formula, to John Pemberton's creation, to the sacred coca leaf of the Andes that has been used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. There's something almost mystical about this connection, a sense that Coca-Cola, despite all its modern industrial production and global distribution, still contains an essence of that ancient plant, still carries within it a drop of the divine intoxicant that the Inca revered. This narrative appeals to a certain kind of consumer who values authenticity and tradition, who wants to believe that the Coca-Cola they're drinking today is fundamentally the same as the Coca-Cola of a century ago. The practical answer is probably that removing coca entirely would require reformulating the product, and any change to Coca-Cola's flavor, no matter how small, risks alienating consumers who have been conditioned to expect an exact and unchanging taste. Coca-Cola's flavor is one of the most precisely controlled in the food industry. Every batch, anywhere in the world, is supposed to taste exactly the same. Removing an ingredient, even one that contributes minimally to flavor, would require adjustment of other ingredients to compensate, and those adjustments might be detectable to sensitive palates. The risk isn't worth it, especially when the current arrangement is legal and well established. But there's something else at work here, something about the power of origins and associations. Coca-Cola's history with cocaine is simultaneously suppressed and exploited. The company doesn't talk about it in advertising, doesn't mention it in official communications, actively discourages journalists and historians from dwelling on it. But the name itself carries an echo of that history. People who know, who have read the history, who understand where the name comes from, they carry that knowledge into their experience of the drink. The transgressive origin, the forbidden drug, the transformation from medicine to pleasure, all of this adds layers of meaning to what is, objectively, just sugar water with caffeine and flavorings. The mythology matters, the history matters, and Coca-Cola, whether consciously or not, has understood this and has maintained the connection, however thin, to its cocaine past. By the 1920s, Coca-Cola had successfully navigated the transition from patent medicine to soft drink, from local soda fountain specialty to national brand, from cocaine-containing tonic to caffeine and sugar beverage. The company had fought off government regulation, defeated trademark imitators, and erased or rewritten its more problematic history. What came next was even more audacious. Global domination, achieved through brilliant marketing, ruthless business practices, and a deep understanding of human psychology. Coca-Cola was about to stop being merely an American product and become a global symbol of America itself, for better and for worse. The architect of Coca-Cola's global expansion was Robert Woodruff, who became president of the company in 1923, at age 33, and would dominate the organization for the next 6 decades. Woodruff was the son of Ernest Woodruff, an Atlanta banker who had led an investor group that purchased Coca-Cola from Asa Candler's family in 1919 for $25 million, an enormous sum at the time, and one of the largest business transactions in American history to that point. Robert Woodruff had worked in various businesses, including his father's bank and the White Motor Company, before being brought in to run Coca-Cola. He had no experience in the beverage industry, but he had something more valuable: vision. Woodruff's vision was elegantly simple. Coca-Cola should be available everywhere, all the time, within arm's reach of desire. He wanted Coca-Cola to be so ubiquitous, so embedded in daily life, that people would drink it without thinking, that reaching for a Coke would become as automatic as breathing. This required moving beyond soda fountains, beyond the pharmacy counters, where Coca-Cola had originated, and into every possible channel of distribution. It required bottles, lots of bottles, everywhere bottles could be sold. The bottling system that Asa Candler had so carelessly given away in 1899 was, by the 1920s, a sprawling network of independent bottlers operating under contracts with Coca-Cola. These bottlers bought syrup from the company at a fixed price, combined it with carbonated water and sugar, bottled the result, and sold it to retailers. The system was decentralized and difficult to control. Some bottlers were aggressive entrepreneurs who built substantial businesses. Others were small operators barely scraping by. Quality varied, distribution was patchy. Woodruff saw that he needed to transform this chaotic system into a disciplined army. He couldn't change the fundamental contract. The perpetual bottling rights that had been sold in 1899 were legally binding and couldn't be revoked, but he could use incentives, pressure, and the company's control over syrup supply to shape bottlers' behavior. He established quality standards and threatened to cut off syrup to bottlers who didn't meet them. He pushed bottlers to invest in modern equipment, to expand their distribution territories, to advertise aggressively. He created a culture within the bottling system where success was measured by market penetration, by the percentage of potential customers who had access to Coca-Cola. One of Woodruff's key innovations was the 6-bottle carton, introduced in 1923. Before this, bottles were sold individually, one at a time, usually consumed immediately at the point of purchase. The 6-pack changed consumption patterns fundamentally. People could buy Coca-Cola and take it home. They could stock their refrigerators. They could serve it to guests. Coca-Cola moved from being an occasional treat, purchased outside the home, to being a household staple. This shift multiplied consumption because people who had Coca-Cola at home drank it more frequently, more casually, less as a special occasion, and more as a default beverage choice. Woodruff also pushed hard on the idea that Coca-Cola should be ice cold. Thirst knows no season was one advertising slogan, emphasizing that Coca-Cola was appropriate year-round, but the company understood that the drink tasted best, was most refreshing and satisfying, when served very cold. This created a need for refrigeration equipment. Coca-Cola salesmen sold or subsidized coolers for retailers, distinctive red boxes with the Coca-Cola logo prominently displayed, ensuring that the brand was visible even as customers reached for other products. The company developed vending machines, first mechanical and later electrical, that could dispense cold bottles automatically. By the 1930s, Coca-Cola coolers and vending machines were everywhere. Gas stations, grocery stores, factories, offices, parks. You were never far from a cold Coke. The advertising during Woodruff's era was revolutionary. Previous Coca-Cola advertising had focused on the product's qualities, its taste, its refreshing properties, its medicinal benefits back when those could still be claimed. Woodruff shifted to lifestyle advertising, to selling not the product but the experience, the feeling, the social meaning of drinking Coca-Cola. The famous "The Pause That Refreshes" campaign, launched in 1929, didn't talk about flavor or ingredients. It talked about taking a break, about stepping back from work or worry, about creating a moment of pleasure in a busy day. Coca-Cola became associated with relaxation, with happiness, with American optimism. The timing was crucial. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and suddenly millions of Americans had very little money and a great deal of anxiety. Coca-Cola, at 5 cents a bottle, was an affordable luxury, a small pleasure in hard times. The company's advertising during the Depression emphasized normalcy, happiness, the simple joys of life. Norman Rockwell painted Coca-Cola advertisements showing idealized American scenes, young people on dates, families picnicking, workers on lunch breaks, all of them smiling, all of them holding bottles of Coke. These weren't just selling beverages, they were selling an idea of America, a vision of what American life could and should be. The most iconic Coca-Cola advertising image emerged in 1931, the Coca-Cola Santa Claus. The company commissioned illustrator Haddon Sundblom to create Santa Claus images for their Christmas advertising. Sundblom painted a warm, jolly, grandfatherly Santa in red and white robes, the colors of Coca-Cola's branding, drinking a bottle of Coke while taking a break from delivering presents. This Santa wasn't the stern religious figure of earlier European traditions or the thin elf of some American versions. He was plump, cheerful, relatable, approachable, and he was drinking Coca-Cola. The Coca-Cola Santa appeared in ads every Christmas for decades, and he fundamentally shaped the modern image of Santa Claus. It's an exaggeration to say that Coca-Cola invented Santa. Many elements of the modern Santa had been established before Sundblom's paintings, but Coca-Cola certainly standardized and popularized the image. The company's Santa became the Santa, recognized around the world, associated forever with Christmas, and subtly but powerfully, with Coca-Cola. It was brilliant marketing, associating the product with the most emotionally powerful holiday in the Western calendar, making Coca-Cola part of the ritual and tradition of Christmas itself. World War II transformed Coca-Cola from an American brand with international presence to a genuinely global product. When the United States entered the war in 1941, Woodruff made a commitment that would define the company for the next half-century. He pledged that every American service member, anywhere in the world, would be able to buy a Coca-Cola for 5 cents, regardless of what it cost the company to deliver it there. This was framed as patriotism, as supporting the troops, and it was, but it was also brilliant business strategy disguised as public service. The military agreed to provide transportation and logistical support for Coca-Cola equipment and personnel. The company sent technical observers, civilians with military rank, to follow American forces into combat zones, and set up bottling plants as close to the front lines as possible. These portable bottling operations were engineering marvels, complete plants that could be packed into ships or trucks, moved to forward areas, and set up to produce thousands of bottles per day. At the height of the war, Coca-Cola had 64 bottling plants operating on military bases around the world, from England to North Africa, from India to the Pacific Islands, producing 5 billion bottles for American service members. The impact on soldiers was profound. In the misery of war, in jungles and deserts and frozen mountains, a cold Coke was a taste of home, a reminder of what they were fighting for, a connection to normal American life. Service members wrote letters home, mentioning how much they appreciated having Coca-Cola available. They posed for photos holding Coke bottles. The drink became a symbol of American culture and American power, something uniquely American that could be delivered anywhere American military forces went. But the impact on Coca-Cola's global expansion was equally profound. These military bottling plants, once established, didn't disappear when the war ended. Many were converted to civilian operations, sold to local bottlers, or used as the foundation for new international markets. And the millions of service members who had drunk Coca-Cola overseas came home with the habit firmly established. They had been drinking Coke daily for years. They expected it to be available. They wanted to continue drinking it. The company had created a generation of loyal consumers at government expense. Moreover, local populations in the countries where American forces were stationed got their first taste of Coca-Cola during the war. European children who had never seen the drink before would crowd around American soldiers, hoping for a sip or an empty bottle. In Japan, in the years after the war, Coca-Cola became associated with American occupation, but also with modernity, with the future, with the prosperity and power that America represented. The drink was exotic and familiar simultaneously, distinctively American, but also in its simplicity and sweetness, universally appealing. Woodruff understood that the war had given Coca-Cola an extraordinary opportunity. The world was being rebuilt, new markets were opening, and American products, American culture, American ways of life were ascendant. Coca-Cola could ride this wave of American influence, and become not just present in other countries but embedded in their cultures. The strategy was the same as it had been in America: ubiquity, aggressive marketing, association with positive emotions and experiences, and above all, consistency. A Coke in Tokyo should taste exactly like a Coke in New York. The formula, the flavor, the brand experience, all had to be identical worldwide. This required extraordinary logistical sophistication. Coca-Cola syrup was produced in concentrated form in the United States and shipped to bottlers around the world. But water quality varied, sugar availability varied, bottling standards varied. The company had to develop quality control systems that could ensure consistency across dozens of countries with different regulations, different ingredient sources, different manufacturing traditions. They had to train local bottlers, many of them new to the beverage industry, in Coca-Cola's methods. They had to adapt their marketing to different cultures while maintaining a coherent global brand identity. The adaptation to local cultures was delicate work. Coca-Cola's fundamental branding, the red and white colors, the distinctive script logo, the contour bottle shape, these remained constant worldwide. But advertising had to be tailored to local sensibilities, local languages, local cultural references. A Coca-Cola ad in India couldn't look like a Coca-Cola ad in America, even though the core message, associating the drink with happiness and refreshment, was the same. The company hired local advertising agencies, worked with local celebrities and athletes, sponsored local events and sports teams. The goal was to make Coca-Cola feel simultaneously American and local, foreign and familiar, exotic and everyday. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola was available in more countries than any other consumer product. The company had bottling operations on every continent except Antarctica. The red Coca-Cola logo was one of the most widely recognized symbols on Earth, more recognizable in many places than national flags or religious symbols. This ubiquity fed on itself. Coca-Cola was everywhere, because it was everywhere. Retailers stocked it because customers expected it. Customers bought it because it was reliably available. The network effects of ubiquity created a moat that competitors found almost impossible to breach. The company's main competitor, Pepsi-Cola, had struggled during the Depression and had nearly gone bankrupt. Pepsi survived by selling larger bottles for the same price as Coca-Cola, positioning itself as the value brand, twice as much for a nickel. The strategy worked domestically. Pepsi captured market share from price-conscious consumers, but internationally, Pepsi was far behind. Coca-Cola had the first-mover advantage, the military logistics network, the association with American victory in World War II. Pepsi would spend the next several decades trying to catch up, with mixed success. In most international markets, Coca-Cola dominated so thoroughly that Pepsi was a distant second or irrelevant. The 1950s and 1960s were Coca-Cola's golden age, the period when the company seemed invincible, when growth appeared limitless, when the product was so embedded in global culture that its continued dominance seemed inevitable. American tourists traveling abroad would seek out Coca-Cola as a taste of home. International visitors to America would drink Coca-Cola as a quintessentially American experience. The product had transcended its origins as a beverage and become a cultural artifact, a symbol that carried meanings far beyond its function as a source of refreshment. But this cultural power came with complications. As American foreign policy became increasingly controversial, particularly with the Vietnam War, Coca-Cola became a target for anti-American sentiment. The drink represented American cultural imperialism, American economic dominance, American military power. In some countries, nationalist movements called for boycotts of Coca-Cola. Left-wing intellectuals wrote essays denouncing Coca-Cola as a symbol of capitalist exploitation, of the homogenization of global culture, of the destruction of local traditions and local beverages by a rapacious multinational corporation. The criticism wasn't entirely wrong. Coca-Cola did contribute to the erosion of local beverage traditions. In countries where people had historically drunk tea, or fresh fruit juices, or fermented drinks specific to their region, Coca-Cola offered a standardized alternative that through aggressive marketing and wide availability, gradually displaced local options. This was especially true for younger generations, who associated Coca-Cola with modernity and sophistication, who saw drinking Coke as a way to participate in global youth culture, who abandoned their parents' traditional drinks as old-fashioned. The company also faced accusations, some documented and others disputed, of involvement in labor abuses, environmental destruction, and collaboration with authoritarian regimes. In countries where Coca-Cola bottlers were major employers, the company had significant economic and political power. Critics alleged that this power was used to suppress labor unions, to obtain favorable treatment from governments, to avoid environmental regulations. Coca-Cola's standard response was that bottlers were independent businesses, that the company couldn't control their behavior, that any problems were local issues to be resolved locally. This was legally accurate, but morally evasive. The company had enormous influence over its bottlers, through its control of syrup supply, and its ability to revoke bottling agreements. When it chose to exercise that influence, it could. When it chose not to, it couldn't hide behind legal technicalities. In the 1980s and 1990s, as globalization accelerated, Coca-Cola expanded into new markets with even more aggression. The fall of the Soviet Union opened Eastern Europe and Russia to Western consumer products. China's economic reforms opened the world's largest market. India, after decades of protecting local industries, gradually opened to foreign investment. In each case, Coca-Cola was among the first foreign companies to enter, moving quickly to establish bottling operations, distribution networks, and brand presence before competitors could catch up. The strategy in these new markets repeated patterns established decades earlier. Massive advertising campaigns associated Coca-Cola with youth, modernity, and global culture. Sponsorship of sports, music, and entertainment events made the brand visible and desirable. Aggressive pricing and promotion got the product into consumers' hands. And once consumption patterns were established, once Coca-Cola became a habitual purchase, the company could gradually raise prices and capture the profit from the market position it had expensively created. But entry into these markets wasn't always smooth. In India, Coca-Cola had operated during the 1950s and 1960s, but was expelled in 1977 when the government demanded that the company share its secret formula and reduce its ownership stake in its Indian subsidiary. Coca-Cola refused and left the country entirely. When India reopened to foreign investment in the early 1990s, Coca-Cola returned, but it faced a strong local competitor, Thumbs Up, that had captured the cola market during Coca-Cola's absence. The company solved this problem by buying Thumbs Up, acquiring both the brand and its distribution network, then gradually pushing Thumbs Up aside in favor of Coca-Cola. It was efficient and ruthless. Classic Coca-Cola strategy. If you can't beat a competitor by out-competing them, buy them and eliminate them. By the end of the 20th century, Coca-Cola had achieved something unprecedented in business history. The company sold its product in virtually every country on Earth. More than 1 billion servings of Coca-Cola products were consumed every day. The brand was valued at tens of billions of dollars, more than the GDP of many countries. Coca-Cola wasn't just a successful product, it was a global institution, woven into the fabric of daily life for hundreds of millions of people, associated with everything from family meals to global sporting events, from childhood memories to international diplomacy. And yet, for all this success, the company faced growing challenges as the new century began. Health concerns about sugar and obesity were mounting. Environmental concerns about plastic bottles and water usage were intensifying. Competition from other beverages, from bottled water to energy drinks to specialty coffees, was fragmenting the beverage market. And underneath all of this, a fundamental question was emerging. In a world increasingly aware of health, environment, and corporate responsibility, could a company built on selling sugar water continue to thrive? The 21st century has not been kind to Coca-Cola, or rather it has forced the company to confront consequences and contradictions that could be ignored or deflected in earlier eras. The product that had seemed invincible, that had conquered the world through brilliant marketing and relentless expansion, suddenly faced existential questions about its role in public health, environmental sustainability, and social responsibility. The very qualities that had made Coca-Cola successful, its ubiquity, its sweetness, its association with pleasure and indulgence, became liabilities in an age increasingly concerned with obesity, diabetes, and the long-term costs of overconsumption. The sugar problem emerged gradually, but inexorably. For most of Coca-Cola's history, sugar had been seen as benign, even wholesome. Sugar provided energy. It made things taste good. It was associated with celebrations, with rewards, with childhood treats. The idea that sugar could be harmful, that it could be addictive, that it could contribute to chronic diseases, was not part of mainstream medical or public consciousness. Coca-Cola contained a lot of sugar, about 39 grams per 12-ounce serving, roughly 10 teaspoons, but so did many other foods and beverages. The company's position was that Coca-Cola was fine in moderation, that any food or drink could be part of a balanced diet, that the key was personal responsibility and lifestyle choices. This position became increasingly difficult to maintain as scientific evidence accumulated. Studies published in major medical journals throughout the 1990s and 2000s established clear links between sugar consumption and obesity. They showed that liquid sugar, the kind in soft drinks, was particularly problematic because it didn't trigger satiety responses the way solid food did. You could drink a Coke, consume 140 calories, and still be just as hungry as before. Those calories were essentially invisible to your body's regulatory systems, added on top of whatever else you ate, contributing to caloric excess without providing any nutritional value. Further research connected sugar consumption to type 2 diabetes, not just indirectly through obesity, but through direct metabolic effects. High sugar intake, particularly of fructose, the sugar that comprises half of table sugar, and high fructose corn syrup, was shown to promote insulin resistance. The fundamental problem in type 2 diabetes, populations that consumed large amounts of sugary beverages had dramatically higher rates of diabetes, even controlling for other factors like overall caloric intake and body weight. The evidence became so strong that public health organizations began calling for regulations on sugary drinks. The World Health Organization recommended that countries tax sugar-sweetened beverages to reduce consumption. The American Heart Association set recommended limits on added sugar intake. limits that a single can of Coca-Cola exceeded. Pediatric associations recommended that children consume no sugary beverages at all. The scientific and medical consensus was clear. Sugary drinks were a major contributor to the twin epidemics of obesity and diabetes that were devastating public health, particularly in the United States but increasingly worldwide. Coca-Cola's response to this mounting evidence followed a playbook that had been developed decades earlier by the tobacco industry, which had faced similar scientific consensus about the harms of its products. The company didn't deny that excessive sugar consumption could be problematic. Instead, they argued that the problem was complex, that many factors contributed to obesity and diabetes, that singling out one food or beverage was simplistic and unfair. They emphasized personal responsibility, the idea that informed consumers making their own choices should be free to drink whatever they wanted. They funded research, often through obscure foundations and institutes, that muddied the scientific waters, that suggested maybe exercise was more important than diet, that maybe obesity was more about sedentary lifestyles than about what people ate or drank. This strategy of manufacturing doubt, of creating the appearance of scientific controversy where little existed, was remarkably effective for a while. It slowed regulatory action. It gave politicians and policymakers who were inclined to favor industry cover to avoid taking action. It confused the public, making people uncertain about whether Coca-Cola was really that bad, or whether the concerns were overblown. But it couldn't stop the accumulation of evidence or the growing public awareness that something was seriously wrong with modern diets, and that sugary drinks were a major part of the problem. The first major regulatory action came in 2013, when Mexico, facing the highest obesity rates in the world, and a diabetes crisis that was overwhelming its healthcare system, imposed a significant tax on sugary beverages. The tax was 1 peso per liter, roughly a 10% price increase. The public health community watched closely to see what would happen. Would a tax actually reduce consumption? Would it improve health outcomes? Or would people just pay more and continue drinking the same amounts? The results published in studies over the following years were clear. Consumption of sugary drinks in Mexico declined by about 6% in the first year after the tax, with larger declines among lower-income households who were most sensitive to price changes. More importantly, the declines appeared to be sustained and even increased over time as people adjusted to the new prices and found alternatives. Consumption of bottled water increased, suggesting that people were substituting healthier beverages rather than just drinking less overall liquid. Other countries and cities followed Mexico's lead. Chile implemented a comprehensive package of regulations including taxes, advertising restrictions, and mandatory warning labels on sugary drinks. Berkeley, California, became the first U.S. city to pass a soda tax, followed by Philadelphia, Seattle, and others. The United Kingdom implemented a tiered tax based on sugar content, creating incentives for beverage companies to reformulate their products with less sugar. These interventions collectively represented the first serious regulatory challenge to the soft drink industry in decades. Coca-Cola fought back with all the resources at its disposal. The company funded front groups and industry associations that campaigned against soda taxes, often using rhetoric about freedom of choice and opposition to nanny-state paternalism. They contributed to political campaigns for candidates who opposed regulation. They threatened to move operations or cut jobs if taxes were implemented. They offered voluntary pledges to reduce advertising to children or to promote diet beverages, trying to head off mandatory regulations with promises of self-regulation. But the company also recognized that they needed to adapt their product portfolio. Diet Coke had been introduced in 1982 as a zero-calorie alternative sweetened with aspartame. It had been successful, particularly among women who wanted the Coca-Cola taste without the calories, but it had never approached the sales of regular Coke. Now the company pushed diet and zero-calorie versions more aggressively. They introduced Coca-Cola Zero, later rebranded as Coca-Cola Zero Sugar, which was marketed toward men who found Diet Coke too feminine. They acquired brands like Vitamin Water and Honest Tea that had healthier images, even if they still contained significant sugar. They invested in completely different categories, buying stakes in sports drinks, enhanced waters, and even coffee chains. The strategy was diversification, reducing dependence on the core Coca-Cola product by offering a portfolio of beverages that could appeal to consumers with different preferences and health concerns. But this created an internal contradiction. If Coca-Cola spent too much effort promoting healthier alternatives, it implicitly acknowledged that regular Coke was unhealthy. If it admitted that sugar was a problem, it undermined the product that still generated the majority of its profits. The company was trapped between the need to defend its flagship product and the need to adapt to changing consumer preferences and public health realities. The artificial sweetener solution had its own problems. Aspartame, saccharin and other sugar substitutes had been controversial since their introduction, with periodic scares about cancer risks and other health effects. While scientific consensus held that approved artificial sweeteners were safe in normal consumption amounts, public perception was more skeptical. Many consumers didn't trust artificial sweeteners, didn't like their taste, or were concerned about potential long-term effects. Diet sodas captured some market share but couldn't replace the revenue from regular sodas. Moreover, emerging research suggested that artificial sweeteners might not be the solution they appeared to be. Studies showed that people who drank diet sodas didn't lose weight and sometimes gained weight, possibly because the sweet taste without calories confused metabolic signaling, or because people compensated by eating more, or because artificial sweeteners altered gut bacteria in ways that promoted weight gain. The evidence was mixed and controversial, but it suggested that simply replacing sugar with artificial sweeteners wasn't a magic solution to the obesity epidemic. The company's water usage became another major source of controversy. Producing Coca-Cola requires enormous amounts of water, not just the water that goes into the drink itself, but the water used in processing, cleaning and manufacturing. On average, producing 1 liter of Coca-Cola required about 2.7 liters of total water, a ratio that seemed absurdly wasteful in regions where water was scarce. And Coca-Cola operated bottling plants in many such regions, drawing groundwater from aquifers that were already stressed, competing with local communities for a vital resource. The most notorious case occurred in Kerala, India, where a Coca-Cola bottling plant in the village of Plakimada was accused of depleting local groundwater and contaminating what remained with waste products from the manufacturing process. Local farmers found that their wells were drying up. The water that remained had a foul taste and smell. Agricultural productivity declined. The company denied responsibility, claiming their water usage was within legal limits and that any contamination must have come from other sources. But the local community organized, protested and eventually convinced the state government to revoke the plant's operating license in 2004. Similar controversies erupted in other locations in Rajasthan, India, where Coca-Cola was accused of depleting groundwater during a severe drought. In Colombia and El Salvador and Mexico, where communities claimed that Coca-Cola bottling operations were taking water that local people needed for drinking and irrigation. The pattern was consistent. Coca-Cola would open a bottling plant in a region with cheap labor and growing markets. The plant would extract large amounts of water, local water tables would fall or local water quality would decline, communities would protest, and Coca-Cola would deny responsibility while pointing to the jobs and economic development the plant created. The company's response to these water controversies evolved over time, initially defensive, denying problems and emphasizing legal compliance. Coca-Cola gradually adopted a more sophisticated approach. They commissioned studies of water usage and water impact. They invested in water conservation technologies to reduce the water required per liter of product. They funded water replenishment projects, building rainwater collection systems and watershed protection programs in the communities where they operated, claiming to return to nature an amount of water equal to what they used in their beverages. By 2015, the company announced it had achieved water neutrality, replenishing all the water used in its drinks. Environmental advocates were skeptical. Replenishing water through conservation projects in one location didn't necessarily help communities in other locations where Coca-Cola's operations were depleting local supplies. The water that went into a Coke in a bottle shipped to a different country couldn't be replenished to the community where it was extracted. The accounting was creative at best, misleading at worst. But the company's investment in water issues, even if motivated by public relations concerns rather than genuine environmental commitment, did result in some positive outcomes. Water conservation technologies developed for Coca-Cola were shared with other industries. Watershed protection projects benefited local ecosystems beyond just offsetting Coca-Cola's usage. The plastic bottle problem proved even more intractable. Coca-Cola had enthusiastically adopted plastic bottles in the 1970s and 1980s, replacing glass bottles in many markets because plastic was lighter, cheaper, and didn't break. The iconic Contour glass bottle remained in use for nostalgia and premium markets, but the majority of Coca-Cola sold worldwide came in plastic bottles of various sizes. These bottles, made from polyethylene terephthalate or PET plastic, were technically recyclable, but in practice most ended up in landfills or worse in oceans and waterways where they broke down into microplastics that persisted in the environment indefinitely. By the 2010s, as awareness of plastic pollution grew, particularly concerning ocean plastics, Coca-Cola found itself identified as one of the world's largest plastic polluters. Beach cleanups and river cleanups consistently found that Coca-Cola bottles were among the most common branded items in plastic waste. The company produced an estimated 3 million tons of plastic packaging annually, more than any other beverage company. This plastic was contributing to a global environmental catastrophe, to seas filled with plastic debris, to marine animals dying from ingesting plastic, to microplastics entering the human food chain. Coca-Cola's response was to emphasize recycling, to claim that the problem was not plastic production but inadequate waste management and recycling infrastructure. The company invested in recycling programs, funded public awareness campaigns encouraging recycling, and set goals for using recycled content in its bottles. They announced ambitious targets. By 2030, they would collect and recycle the equivalent of every bottle or can they sold. They would make all their packaging recyclable. They would use 50% recycled material in their bottles. These commitments sounded impressive but faced practical obstacles. Recycling rates for plastic bottles, even in countries with well-developed recycling infrastructure, rarely exceeded 50% and were often much lower. In developing countries where Coca-Cola was experiencing its fastest growth, recycling infrastructure was minimal or non-existent. The company could fund recycling programs, but it couldn't force governments to build waste management systems or consumers to recycle properly. And even when bottles were recycled, the process wasn't perfectly efficient. Plastic degrades with each recycling cycle, eventually becoming unusable and ending up as waste anyway. Environmental advocates argued that the only real solution was reducing plastic production, shifting to reusable bottles, or eliminating single-use packaging entirely. But these solutions threatened Coca-Cola's business model, which depended on convenient, disposable packaging that could be sold anywhere. Reusable bottles required collection and cleaning infrastructure. They were heavier and more expensive. They limited flexibility in packaging sizes and formats. Coca-Cola experimented with reusable bottles in some markets, but the company never fully committed to a transition away from single-use plastic. The economic incentives, the convenience for consumers, the compatibility with existing distribution systems, all favored continued use of disposable plastic bottles regardless of environmental consequences. The Coca leaf connection, meanwhile, remained a quirky footnote to Coca-Cola's story, known to trivia enthusiasts and historians, but largely invisible to consumers. The Stepan Company continued to import coca leaves from Peru, process them to remove cocaine, and sell the extract to Coca-Cola. The cocaine was sold to Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals, which refined it for medical use. It was all perfectly legal, regulated by the DEA, and rarely discussed publicly. But occasionally the arrangement would surface in news stories, usually with a tone of amused surprise that Coca-Cola still contained coca, that the name was still literally accurate more than a century after the drink's creation. In 2009, New York Times journalist Michael Moss investigated the coca leaf supply chain and wrote an article revealing details about the process. He described how Stepan imported about 100 metric tons of coca leaves annually from Peru, far more than would be needed just for flavoring Coca-Cola, suggesting that the cocaine extraction was actually more important to Stepan's business than the flavoring extract. He noted that Coca-Cola had exclusive rights to coca flavoring in the United States, creating a legal monopoly that prevented competitors from using coca even in decocainized form. The article presented the arrangement as a bizarre anachronism, a remnant of the patent medicine era preserved through legal technicalities and corporate tradition. Coca-Cola's response was brief and non-committal. A company spokesman confirmed that Coca-Cola contained a coca leaf extract with cocaine removed, but declined to provide details about amounts or processing methods, citing the secret formula. The DEA confirmed that the arrangement was legal and properly regulated, and the story faded, as stories about Coca-Cola's ingredients always did, without significantly impacting the company's operations or public image. Most consumers didn't care that Coca-Cola contained coca extract. The cocaine was gone, and that was what mattered to regulators and public health officials. The coca leaf was just an ingredient, no different from vanilla or cinnamon, except for the unusual regulatory oversight required for its importation and processing. But there was a deeper issue embedded in this coca connection, one that went beyond the specifics of Coca-Cola's formula. The coca leaf itself, the plant that had been sacred to Andean peoples for millennia, that had been transformed into cocaine and then into a global drug crisis, remained illegal in most contexts. Growing coca was prohibited under international drug treaties, except for a few specific uses including the tiny amount needed for Coca-Cola flavoring. Indigenous communities in Peru and Bolivia, who had traditionally used coca for medicine, for ritual, for coping with altitude and hunger and hardship, were criminalized for practices that had been part of their cultures since before recorded history. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola, a multinational corporation, had legal access to coca that ordinary people did not. The company could import coca, process it, use it in a product sold worldwide. But a Bolivian farmer who grew coca for traditional use, who chewed the leaves or made tea from them as his ancestors had done for generations, was technically violating international law. The contradiction was profound. The plant's cultural and traditional uses were prohibited, but its commercial exploitation by a wealthy corporation was protected. It was a perfect encapsulation of how drug policy and international law served corporate and state interests rather than cultural preservation or human rights. By the early 1980s, Coca-Cola faced a crisis that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. They were losing, not catastrophically, not in a way that threatened immediate collapse, but steadily, measurably, year after year, Coca-Cola was losing market share to its arch-rival Pepsi-Cola. This was more than a business problem. For a company whose entire identity was built on being number one, on being the dominant cola, on being synonymous with soft drinks themselves, losing to Pepsi felt like an existential threat, and the way Coca-Cola responded to this threat would produce one of the most spectacular corporate blunders in American business history, a mistake so profound that it became a case study taught in business schools worldwide, as an example of how even the most successful companies can lose touch with what made them successful in the first place. The rivalry between Coca-Cola and Pepsi was almost as old as the soft drink industry itself. Pepsi had been created in 1893 by pharmacist Caleb Bradham in New Bern, North Carolina, following almost exactly the same formula as Coca-Cola's creation, a pharmacist experimenting with coca and cola nut extracts, creating a fountain drink, claiming medicinal properties. Bradham originally called his drink Brad's Drink before renaming it Pepsi-Cola, supposedly because it aided digestion and relieved dyspepsia, though this etymology is disputed. Like Coca-Cola, Pepsi contained cocaine in its early years. Unlike Coca-Cola, the cocaine was removed as regulations tightened and public attitudes shifted. For its first several decades, Pepsi struggled in Coca-Cola's shadow. The company went bankrupt in 1923, was reorganized, went bankrupt again in 1931 during the Depression. Coca-Cola could have purchased Pepsi for almost nothing during these bankruptcy periods, but declined, reportedly because they didn't see Pepsi as a serious threat, and didn't want to deal with antitrust concerns about monopolizing the cola market. This decision would prove to be a historic mistake, because Pepsi not only survived but found a strategy that worked. During the Depression, when every penny mattered, Pepsi introduced a 12-ounce bottle sold for the same nickel that bought a 6.5-ounce Coca-Cola. Twice as much for a nickel too became Pepsi's advertising jingle, and it resonated with price-conscious consumers. Pepsi positioned itself as the value brand, the smart choice for people who wanted cola but couldn't afford to pay Coca-Cola's premium. This strategy captured market share, particularly among working-class consumers, and established Pepsi as a legitimate national brand rather than just another failed Coca-Cola imitator. But it was in the 1960s and 1970s that Pepsi truly emerged as a threat to Coca-Cola's dominance, and the strategy that made this possible was brilliant in its simplicity. Pepsi would target young people, positioning itself not as the value brand, but as the choice of a new generation that rejected their parents' preferences. The Pepsi Generation advertising campaign, launched in 1963, didn't talk about price or taste or ingredients. It talked about youth, vitality, being part of something new and exciting. Drinking Pepsi became an identity statement, a way for young people to differentiate themselves from the older generation that drank Coke. The campaign was spectacularly effective because it tapped into the generational tensions of the 1960s, the sense among young people that they were fundamentally different from their parents, that they had different values and different tastes and different ways of seeing the world. If your parents drank Coke, if Coke was the establishment drink, then drinking Pepsi became a small act of rebellion, a way to signal that you were young and modern, and not stuck in the past. Pepsi sales among teenagers and young adults surged, And because people tend to maintain the brand preferences they establish in youth, Pepsi was creating a pipeline of lifelong customers who would grow older but continue to prefer Pepsi. Coca-Cola responded with its own youth-oriented advertising, but it rang hollow. Coca-Cola couldn't position itself as the rebel brand because it wasn't. It was the establishment. It was what your parents drank, what your grandparents drank. It was American tradition, which was exactly what young people in the turbulent 1960s and 1970s were questioning. Coca-Cola's advertising emphasized heritage, authenticity, being the real thing. These were powerful messages for maintaining loyalty among existing customers, but they didn't attract young people the way Pepsi did. Then in 1975, Pepsi launched the Pepsi Challenge, a marketing campaign that would haunt Coca-Cola for the next decade. The concept was simple: set up tables in shopping malls and supermarkets, offer people 2 unmarked cups of cola, 1 Pepsi and 1 Coke, and ask which they preferred. The results, according to Pepsi, showed that people consistently preferred Pepsi in blind taste tests, even people who said they usually drank Coke. Pepsi ran television commercials showing these taste tests, showing people's surprise when they discovered they had chosen Pepsi over Coke, driving home the message that Coke drinkers were loyal to a brand rather than to a superior product. The Pepsi Challenge was devastating to Coca-Cola's self-image because it was difficult to refute. Coca-Cola conducted its own blind taste tests and found that yes, in a single-sip taste test, people did tend to prefer Pepsi slightly more often than Coke. The reason was straightforward: Pepsi was slightly sweeter, and in a single sip, that extra sweetness was more immediately pleasant. But there was a crucial flaw in this methodology that neither Pepsi nor Coca-Cola fully acknowledged at the time. A single sip doesn't predict which drink people would prefer to consume an entire bottle or can of. The extra sweetness that made Pepsi win single-sip tests could become cloying over a full serving, but this nuance was lost in the marketing war. By the early 1980s, Coca-Cola executives were obsessed with the taste test results, and with the slow but steady erosion of their market share. Roberto Goizueta, who became CEO of Coca-Cola in 1981, was particularly determined to reverse the decline. Goizueta was Cuban-born, a chemical engineer by training, and he brought an engineer's mindset to the problem. If Pepsi was winning taste tests because it was sweeter, then Coca-Cola should reformulate its product to be sweeter too. If the problem was the taste of the product, the solution was to change the taste. This logic seems insane in retrospect. Coca-Cola's formula had been essentially unchanged for nearly a century. The consistency of that formula, the fact that a Coke tasted the same in 1985 as it had in 1925, was central to the brand's identity. The formula was supposedly locked in a vault, known only to a handful of people, one of the most famous trade secrets in the world. Changing it would mean admitting that the formula wasn't perfect, that the real thing could be improved, that all the mystique around the secret formula had been misplaced. But Goizueta and the executives around him had convinced themselves that taste was everything, that if they could create a cola that won blind taste tests against Pepsi, market share would follow. Coca-Cola's research and development team spent years working on a new formula. They tested hundreds of variations, finally settling on one that was sweeter and smoother than original Coke, with less of the acidic bite that came from phosphoric acid. In blind taste tests conducted by Coca-Cola, this new formula beat both original Coke and Pepsi. It wasn't even close. Nearly 60% of testers preferred the new formula to original Coke, and it had a clear advantage over Pepsi as well. The company tested the new formula on nearly 200,000 people in focus groups and taste tests, making it one of the most extensively researched product launches in history. But there was something the research couldn't capture. Something about the emotional relationship people had with Coca-Cola that transcended taste. The research asked people which drink they preferred in a blind taste test, but it didn't ask them how they would feel if Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola they had been drinking their entire lives, was taken away and replaced with something different. The research treated Coca-Cola as a product, as a beverage with certain flavor characteristics. But Coca-Cola was more than that. It was memory, tradition, identity. It was grandparents and childhood and baseball games and Christmas. You couldn't capture that in a taste test. On April 23, 1985, Coca-Cola held a press conference at Lincoln Center in New York City to announce the most significant change in the company's history. They were introducing a new formula, sweeter and smoother, that had won taste tests decisively. This new Coke would replace the old formula entirely. Original Coca-Cola, the formula that had existed with minor variations since 1886, would be discontinued. The new product would simply be called Coca-Cola, or sometimes in the press it was referred to as New Coke to distinguish it from the old formula. The initial public reaction was confusion more than outrage. People weren't sure if this was a new product being added to the lineup, or if it was replacing regular Coke. When it became clear that original Coke was being discontinued, that you wouldn't be able to buy the old formula anymore, the reaction intensified. Some people thought it was interesting, were willing to try it, didn't see what the big deal was, but a vocal and growing group of customers were furious. The anger was immediate and intense and completely unexpected by Coca-Cola. The company's hotline, which typically received about 400 calls a day, was flooded with more than 8,000 calls daily, almost all of them complaints. People said they felt betrayed, that Coca-Cola had broken a promise, that the company had no right to change a formula that people loved. Some compared it to changing the American flag or rewriting the Constitution. It was treated not as a business decision but as a cultural violation, an attack on something sacred. Protest groups formed spontaneously. Old Cola Drinkers of America in Seattle claimed to have recruited 100,000 members. A man in San Antonio started a lawsuit claiming that Coca-Cola had fraudulently violated trademark by changing the formula associated with the name. Bottlers, who had not been consulted about the change and were contractually obligated to bottle whatever formula Coca-Cola provided, began receiving complaints from retailers and customers. Some bottlers, particularly in the South where Coca-Cola loyalty was strongest, were alarmed by the intensity of the backlash and began quietly pressuring the company to reconsider. The media coverage was relentless and mostly negative. Comedians made jokes about New Coke on late-night television. News programs ran stories featuring angry customers. Pepsi ran advertisements celebrating Coca-Cola's apparent admission that its old formula was inferior, claiming victory in the cola wars. Pepsi gave all its employees a day off to celebrate. The schadenfreude was palpable. Coca-Cola, the most successful consumer brand in history, had made a catastrophic mistake, and everyone wanted to watch them suffer for it. What was particularly strange was that in blind taste tests conducted after the launch, New Coke still won. People who tasted it without knowing what it was still preferred it to old Coke and to Pepsi. But when they knew they were drinking New Coke, when they were conscious that this was the replacement for the original formula, they hated it. The psychological factors were overwhelming the purely sensory factors. People wanted the old Coke not because it tasted better, but because it was familiar, because it connected them to their past, because changing it felt like losing something important. Inside Coca-Cola, the situation was approaching panic. The company had expected some resistance but nothing like this. They had anticipated that people would try New Coke, realize it tasted better, and switch their preferences. Instead, people were boycotting the product, hoarding old Coke, treating the change as a personal insult. Sales of New Coke were disappointing, not catastrophic but well below projections. More importantly, the brand was being damaged. Coca-Cola was becoming a punchline, a symbol of corporate arrogance and tone deafness. Barely 3 months after the launch, on July 11, 1985, Coca-Cola held another press conference to announce that they were bringing back the original formula. It would be called Coca-Cola Classic to distinguish it from New Coke, which would remain available, but would clearly be the secondary product. The reversal was framed as listening to customers, as responding to overwhelming demand, as a humble admission that the company had made a mistake. Roberto Goizueta, the CEO who had championed New Coke, appeared contrite and relieved, saying, "We have heard you," to the customers who had protested. The reaction this time was jubilation. Customers who had been furious about New Coke were thrilled that old Coke was coming back. People called the company to express their happiness. Retailers reported that people were buying Coca-Cola Classic as soon as it appeared on shelves, stockpiling it as if they were afraid it might disappear again. The return of Coca-Cola Classic was covered as major news, leading television broadcasts and making the front pages of newspapers. It was, in its way, as big a cultural event as the introduction of New Coke had been. And then something interesting happened. Sales of Coca-Cola Classic, the old formula that people had been able to buy just 3 months earlier without any fuss, soared to levels higher than Coca-Cola sales had been before the New Coke launch. The controversy, the anger, The protests, the media coverage, all of it had reminded people how much they cared about Coca-Cola. People who hadn't thought much about their choice of soft drink, who had been drifting toward Pepsi or other alternatives, suddenly rediscovered their loyalty to Coke. The 3 months without old Coke had been long enough to create a sense of loss and a corresponding rush of appreciation when it returned. This led to the inevitable conspiracy theory: had the whole thing been planned? Had Coca-Cola deliberately created a crisis to generate publicity and renew customer loyalty? The theory was plausible. The outcome was enormously beneficial to Coca-Cola. The company's market share increased after Classic was reintroduced. The brand received billions of dollars of free media coverage. The reintroduction felt like a victory, like the people had won, which created positive associations with the brand. And Coca-Cola executives were smart enough, cynical enough, to conceive such a plan. But all the evidence suggests it was exactly what it appeared to be: a genuine mistake followed by a rapid reversal. The company had invested enormous resources in developing and testing new Coke. They had committed to it fully. The internal turmoil during the crisis was real, documented in contemporaneous accounts and interviews. If it had been a planned publicity stunt, someone would have talked, some memo or recording would have emerged. The simpler explanation is the correct one. Coca-Cola made a huge mistake, underestimating the emotional connection customers had with the original formula, and then made the right decision to reverse course quickly, rather than stubbornly defending the mistake. What makes the new Coke disaster so fascinating is what it reveals about brands and consumer psychology. Coca-Cola had spent a century building brand loyalty, creating emotional connections between their product and positive experiences in people's lives. That loyalty was so strong that people revolted when the product changed, even when the change was arguably an improvement in taste. The formula, the actual chemical composition of the drink, turned out to be less important than the idea of the formula. The belief that what you were drinking was the same thing previous generations had drunk, the sense of continuity and tradition. This realization transformed how Coca-Cola approached its business going forward. The company became obsessively protective of the classic formula, or at least of the perception that the formula was unchanged. When they switched from cane sugar to high-fructose corn syrup in the United States, they did it quietly, without announcements, framing it as a minor change in sourcing rather than a formula change. When they adjusted other ingredients over the years, they were careful to maintain that these were not fundamental changes, that the essential character of Coca-Cola remained constant. New Coke lingered for years, renamed Coke 2 in 1992, available in some markets but never achieving significant sales. It was finally discontinued in 2002, 17 years after its introduction, unmourned and largely forgotten. The episode became a cautionary tale taught in business schools: know your brand, understand your customers, don't fix what isn't broken, and if you make a mistake, admit it quickly and reverse course. But there was a darker lesson embedded in the new Coke story, one that businesses and marketers absorbed perhaps too well. The lesson was that emotional attachment to brands could be more powerful than rational evaluation of products. If people loved Coca-Cola not because it tasted best, but because of what it represented, then the product itself mattered less than the story, the mythology, the brand identity. You could sell people almost anything if you wrapped it in the right narrative, if you created the right emotional associations, if you made consumption feel like it meant something beyond just drinking a beverage. This insight, that brand identity and emotional connection mattered more than product quality, would shape consumer capitalism for the next several decades. It would lead to ever more sophisticated marketing, ever more aggressive branding, ever more emphasis on lifestyle and identity over function and value. And Coca-Cola, having learned this lesson through its painful new Coke experience, would become even more focused on selling not a drink but an idea, not refreshment, but happiness itself. There are stories about Coca-Cola that the company does not tell, that do not appear in their official histories or their glossy annual reports, that are not part of the carefully constructed narrative of entrepreneurship and success. These are stories about violence and death, about union organizers murdered in their homes, about communities destroyed by water extraction, about complicity with authoritarian regimes, about the gap between the company's public image of spreading happiness and the brutal realities of how that happiness is produced and distributed. These stories are difficult to verify definitively because they involve events in countries where record-keeping is poor, where witnesses are intimidated or killed, where governments and corporations work together to suppress information. but the accumulation of testimony, of court documents, of investigative journalism, of patterns repeated across multiple countries and decades, paints a picture that is impossible to ignore. The most serious allegations against Coca-Cola concern events in Colombia, where the company's bottling operations became entangled with paramilitary violence against labor unions in the 1990s and early 2000s. Colombia during this period was experiencing a brutal internal conflict involving the government, left-wing guerrilla groups like FARC, and right-wing paramilitary organizations. The paramilitaries nominally fighting against the guerrillas, in practice functioned as death squads targeting anyone deemed subversive or threatening to economic interests. This included labor union members, who were portrayed as communist sympathizers or guerrilla supporters, simply for organizing workers and demanding better wages and conditions. Coca-Cola's operations in Colombia were not directly owned by the parent company, but were run by independent bottlers, the largest of which was Bebidas y Alimentos, operating several plants including a major facility in Carepa. The workers at these plants were unionized under Sinaltrainal, the National Union of Food Industry Workers, which had been aggressively organizing Coca-Cola workers throughout Colombia, demanding higher wages, better benefits, and job security. The union was successful in organizing workers, creating a united front that could negotiate effectively with management. This made the union a problem for the bottlers, whose profit margins depended on keeping labor costs low. In December 1996, gunmen entered the Carepa bottling plant and murdered Isidro Segundo Gil, a union leader, inside the facility. The murder was witnessed by other workers. The gunmen were identified as members of a paramilitary group. Following the murder, paramilitaries held a meeting with workers inside the plant, threatening that anyone who remained in the union would meet the same fate as Gil. Under these death threats, the majority of the union membership at the Carepa plant resigned. The union was effectively destroyed at that facility. Isidro Gil's murder was never solved. No one was prosecuted. The paramilitaries continued to operate openly in the region. This was not an isolated incident. Union leaders at other Coca-Cola bottling plants in Colombia reported threats, harassment, and violence. In 2001, another Sinaltrainal member, Oscar Dario Soto, who worked at a different Coca-Cola bottling plant, was murdered. In 2002, union organizer Adolfo Munera was killed. The pattern was consistent. Union members who were vocal, who organized effectively, who challenged management, would receive threats from paramilitaries. If they did not back down, if they did not leave the company, or resign from the union, they were killed. The murders created a climate of terror that made union organizing nearly impossible at Coca-Cola facilities in Colombia. In 2001, Sinaltrainal, along with the United Steelworkers Union in the United States and the International Labor Rights Fund, filed a lawsuit in U.S. federal court under the Alien Tort Claims Act, alleging that Coca-Cola and its Colombian bottlers had collaborated with paramilitary groups to intimidate, threaten, kidnap, and murder union members. The lawsuit claimed that company management had hired or directed paramilitaries to target union leaders, that security personnel at bottling plants had facilitated the entry of gunmen, and that the company had benefited from the destruction of the union through reduced labor costs and compliant workers. Coca-Cola denied all allegations. The company claimed that the murders were tragic, but were the result of Colombia's internal conflict, not of any actions by Coca-Cola or its bottlers. They emphasized that the bottlers were independent companies, that Coca-Cola did not control their labor practices or security arrangements, that any wrongdoing was the responsibility of the bottlers, not the parent company. They pointed out that paramilitary violence was endemic in Colombia during this period, that thousands of people were killed by these groups, that union members in many industries were targeted because paramilitaries viewed unions as communist fronts. Coca-Cola was not responsible for Colombia's civil conflict, and it was unfair to blame the company for violence committed by independent actors in a war zone. This defense was legally sophisticated, but morally hollow. Yes, Coca-Cola did not directly own the bottling plants, but the company had enormous influence over its bottlers, through its control of syrup supply, its ability to revoke bottling agreements, and its oversight of operations to ensure quality and brand consistency. When Coca-Cola wanted bottlers to meet quality standards or distribution targets, the company had no trouble exercising that influence. The claim that the company was powerless to influence bottlers' labor practices or security decisions was convenient, but not credible. Moreover, Evidence emerged suggesting closer coordination than Coca-Cola admitted. Testimony from former paramilitaries indicated that company managers had met with paramilitary leaders, that payments had been made, that specific union members had been identified as targets. Documents showed that bottling plant security personnel had connections to paramilitary groups. Witnesses described seeing paramilitaries meeting with management inside bottling facilities. The picture that emerged was of a system where bottlers, facing pressure from the parent company to keep costs low and production high, used paramilitary violence as a tool of labor management, and the parent company, while maintaining plausible deniability, tacitly accepted this because it produced the desired results. The lawsuit wound through federal courts for years. In 2006, a judge dismissed the case against Coca-Cola, ruling that there was insufficient evidence linking the parent company to the violence, though the case against the Colombian bottlers could proceed. The ruling was a victory for Coca-Cola legally, but it did not end the controversy. Student groups at universities and high schools across the United States launched campaigns to ban Coca-Cola products from their campuses, citing the Colombia murders. By 2010, more than 60 universities had banned or restricted Coca-Cola sales. The campaigns generated significant media attention and created pressure on the company beyond what the courts could impose. In response to this pressure, Coca-Cola agreed to an independent assessment of labor rights and security conditions at its Colombian bottling operations. The assessment, conducted by a panel appointed by the International Labor Organization, found serious problems: inadequate security for union members, threats and intimidation that had not been properly investigated, failures by management to protect workers' rights to organize. The assessment did not definitively prove that company management had hired paramilitaries to kill union members, but it found a pattern of anti-union intimidation and a failure by the company to take adequate measures to prevent violence. Following the assessment, Coca-Cola implemented some reforms: security protocols for union members, agreements to respect organizing rights, monitoring of labor conditions by outside groups. Whether these reforms were genuine or merely cosmetic is debated. Union representatives in Colombia remained skeptical, reporting continued harassment and intimidation, though not the overt murders of the earlier period. The campus bans gradually ended as the company reached agreements with university groups, but the Colombia episode left a permanent stain on Coca-Cola's reputation among human rights and labor activists. The Colombia story is the most documented and serious allegation of Coca-Cola's involvement with violence, but it is not the only one. In Guatemala, union organizers at Coca-Cola bottling plants in the 1970s and 1980s were murdered during that country's civil war, killed by death squads that targeted labor activists as subversives. In Turkey, union members at Coca-Cola plants reported being harassed and fired for organizing activities. In the Philippines, labor activists working at Coca-Cola facilities faced threats from military-backed paramilitaries during the Marcos dictatorship. The pattern across these cases is similar. In countries with weak labor protections and histories of political violence, Coca-Cola's operations or the operations of its bottlers somehow always managed to benefit from the suppression of unions, from the intimidation or elimination of workers who demanded better treatment. Coca-Cola's relationship with authoritarian regimes extends beyond labor issues to broader questions of complicity with political repression. During the Cold War, when American foreign policy prioritized anti-communism above all else, Coca-Cola often found itself operating in countries governed by military dictatorships that the United States supported. In Brazil under military rule, in Chile under Pinochet, in Argentina during the Dirty War, in South Africa under apartheid, Coca-Cola maintained operations and maintained neutrality about the political systems in which it operated. The company's position was that it was a business, not a political actor, that it served customers regardless of what government was in power, that it was inappropriate for a corporation to take sides in political conflicts. This neutrality was itself a political choice, a decision to prioritize business continuity and profit over human rights. In South Africa, Coca-Cola maintained operations throughout the apartheid era despite international calls for boycotts and divestment. The company claimed it was a force for good, that its presence provided jobs and economic opportunities for black South Africans who would otherwise have even fewer options. Critics pointed out that Coca-Cola's operations legitimized the apartheid regime, that the company paid taxes that funded the system of racial oppression, that its presence allowed the South African government to claim that international business supported or at least accepted apartheid. The most controversial historical episode involves Coca-Cola's relationship with Nazi Germany, a subject the company has been reluctant to discuss in detail. Coca-Cola had established bottling operations in Germany in the 1920s, and by the time the Nazis came to power in 1933, Coke was a popular drink in Germany with growing market share. When World War II began and the United States entered the war against Germany, Coca-Cola faced a dilemma. The company's German operations, run by Max Keith, were cut off from the American parent company, unable to receive Coca-Cola syrup due to wartime trade restrictions. Keith's response was to create a new soft drink using ingredients available in wartime Germany, a drink he called Fanta, from the German word Fantasy. Fanta became enormously popular in Nazi Germany, marketed to the German population and to the military. The drink was advertised at Nazi rallies and sporting events. It was integrated into the war effort, providing refreshment to German soldiers and civilians. And critically, the profits from Fanta sales during the war years remained within the German subsidiary, available to be repatriated to the Coca-Cola parent company after the war ended. After the war, when Germany was occupied and the Nazi regime had fallen, Max Keith traveled to Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta and provided an accounting of the German subsidiary's operations during the war. He turned over the accumulated profits from Fanta sales, millions of dollars. Coca-Cola rewarded Keith for his management of the German operations, appointing him to senior positions overseeing European expansion. The Fanta brand was retained and relaunched as a global product, becoming one of Coca-Cola's major brands, particularly popular in Europe and Latin America. The question that hangs over this history is whether Coca-Cola, through its German subsidiary, actively collaborated with the Nazi regime, or simply continued operations under occupation. The company's position is that Keith maintained the business to preserve it for eventual return to American control, that he had no choice but to work within the Nazi economic system, that creating Fanta was a survival strategy rather than collaboration. Critics note that Keith could have shut down operations, that many companies chose to cease doing business in Nazi Germany, rather than operate under Hitler's government, that the decision to continue production and marketing was a choice that benefited the Nazi war effort. The full truth is probably somewhere in between. Keith was not a Nazi ideologue. His primary loyalty was to Coca-Cola as a business rather than to Nazi ideology. But he was willing to work within the Nazi system, to sell to the Nazi government and military, to use Nazi propaganda channels for marketing, because doing so preserved and grew the business. This was collaboration of a pragmatic rather than ideological nature, but it was collaboration nonetheless. And when Coca-Cola accepted the profits from these wartime operations after 1945, the company became a beneficiary of business conducted under Nazi rule. Coca-Cola has never fully reckoned with this history. The company acknowledges that Fanta was created in Nazi Germany, but frames it as a story of entrepreneurial resilience, of a manager improvising to keep the business alive under difficult circumstances. The collaboration aspects, the fact that the drink funded the Nazi government through taxes, that it supported the German war effort, that Coca-Cola profited from these activities, these are not emphasized. When historians or journalists raise these questions, the company typically responds that it was a different time, that business practices were different, that judging historical actions by contemporary standards is unfair. But the pattern across these stories, from Nazi Germany to apartheid South Africa, to military dictatorships in Latin America, to paramilitary violence in Colombia, is remarkably consistent. Coca-Cola operates in morally compromised situations by claiming neutrality, by separating business decisions from political context, by prioritizing profit and market presence over human rights or ethical considerations. The company argues that it brings jobs and economic development wherever it operates, that its presence is beneficial regardless of political circumstances. This allows Coca-Cola to maintain operations and maintain profit in situations where more ethically scrupulous companies might choose to withdraw. The cumulative effect of these stories is to reveal a company that has been willing to accept, benefit from, and possibly facilitate violence and oppression, when doing so serves business interests. This is not unique to Coca-Cola. Many multinational corporations have similar histories. The global economy is built on extraction and exploitation, on taking resources and labor from poor countries and selling products back to them at prices that generate enormous profits. Violence is often part of this system, used to suppress workers who demand better wages, to remove communities from land needed for resources, to enforce property rights and contract terms. What makes Coca-Cola's case particularly stark is the contrast between the company's public image and these hidden realities. The marketing, the advertising, the brand identity, all of it emphasizes happiness, sharing, togetherness, innocent pleasure. Coca-Cola presents itself as spreading joy around the world, as bringing people together, as a force for good in human life. The disconnect between this image and the reality of murdered union organizers, of communities whose water has been stolen, of collaboration with authoritarian regimes, is profound and disturbing. In 2015, facing continued pressure from activists and negative publicity, Coca-Cola announced new commitments to human rights and labor standards in its supply chain. The company pledged to conduct human rights assessments of its operations, to work with outside groups to monitor conditions, to respect workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively. These commitments were welcomed by some activists as meaningful progress, while others dismissed them as public relations gestures unlikely to produce real change. The question is whether a company like Coca-Cola can truly change, whether it can operate ethically while maintaining the profit margins and growth rates that shareholders demand. The structural logic of capitalism pushes companies toward exploitation, toward externalizing costs onto workers and communities and the environment, toward prioritizing short-term profits over long-term consequences. Coca-Cola operates in dozens of countries where labor protections are weak, where environmental regulations are minimal, where governments are corrupt or complicit with corporate interests. In these contexts, being ethical is expensive. It means paying higher wages, investing in environmental protection, refusing business opportunities that involve moral compromise. Companies that do this will have lower profits than competitors who don't, and in a market economy, they will eventually be outcompeted or acquired. This creates a kind of race to the bottom, where even companies that want to operate ethically are pressured by market forces to cut corners, to look the other way when suppliers engage in exploitation, to prioritize cost reduction over all other considerations. Coca-Cola can make commitments to human rights, and can implement monitoring systems, but as long as the fundamental business model depends on selling sugar water at massive scale with thin profit margins per unit, there will be pressure to reduce costs everywhere possible, and that pressure will be borne by workers, by communities, by the environment. The final reckoning with Coca-Cola requires confronting uncomfortable truths about consumer capitalism itself, the product that brings happiness to hundreds of millions of consumers, that creates pleasant memories and shared experiences, that funds education and sports and cultural events through sponsorships and charitable donations. This same product is built on a foundation of suffering that most consumers never see and never think about. The sugar field worker in Brazil collapsing from heat exhaustion, the union organizer in Colombia receiving death threats, the community in India watching their wells run dry, the child in a slum in Manila, with diabetes and rotting teeth from drinking Coke, because it's cheaper than clean water. These are the hidden costs of happiness in a bottle. Most consumers don't want to think about these costs. It's easier and more pleasant to accept the marketing narrative, to believe that Coca-Cola is just a refreshing beverage, that drinking it is a harmless pleasure, that the company spreading happiness around the world. And Coca-Cola works hard to maintain this illusion, to keep the ugly realities hidden, to present only the positive aspects of its operations. This is why the company fights so hard against regulations and transparency requirements, why it funds research to create doubt about health effects, why it uses its political influence to prevent meaningful oversight. The business model depends on consumers not looking too closely, not asking too many questions, not connecting their purchase to the consequences of that purchase. But we are reaching a point where willful ignorance becomes harder to maintain. The health effects of sugar are too well documented to deny. The environmental impact of plastic bottles and water extraction is too visible to ignore. The testimonies of murdered union organizers and devastated communities are too numerous to dismiss. The choice facing consumers is whether to continue buying products from a company with this history and these ongoing practices, or whether to recognize that every purchase is a political act, that buying Coca-Cola supports and perpetuates systems of exploitation and harm. The company's response to this challenge will likely be more sophisticated marketing, more commitments to sustainability and corporate responsibility, more partnerships with non-profits and international organizations that can provide credibility and cover. Coca-Cola will adapt as it always has, finding new ways to sell the same product to new generations of consumers. The brand is too valuable, the business model too profitable, the company too powerful to simply collapse or disappear. But perhaps the era of unquestioned dominance is ending. Perhaps consumers are becoming more aware and more demanding. Perhaps the social and environmental costs are becoming too large to ignore or externalize. The complete history of Coca-Cola. from cocaine-laced patent medicine to global brand, is ultimately a mirror held up to consumer capitalism itself. It shows us what we are willing to accept, what we are willing to ignore, what we prioritize, and what we sacrifice. It shows us that the most successful product in the history of capitalism is one that provides no nutritional value, that makes people sicker, that damages the environment, that is built on exploitation and violence, but that has succeeded by understanding human psychology better than any product before it, by creating desire and loyalty and identity around something that is essentially worthless. This is not a story with a moral or a lesson or a clear path forward. It is simply the truth about how we got here, about the choices that were made, about the consequences we are living with. What we do with that truth, whether we continue to participate in systems we know to be harmful, whether we demand change or accept the status quo, whether we hold corporations accountable or allow them to continue operating without meaningful restraint. These are questions each person must answer for themselves. But the answer cannot be ignorance, cannot be pretending we don't know what we know. The history is too clear, the evidence too overwhelming, the costs too high. The cocaine is gone from Coca-Cola, removed more than a century ago, but the addiction remains. We are addicted to convenience, to familiar tastes, to brands we trust even when we know we shouldn't trust them. We are addicted to the story we tell ourselves about capitalism and progress and the good life. And Coca-Cola, more than perhaps any other product, embodies both the power of that addiction and the price we pay to maintain it. The choice, as always, is ours, but it is a choice we can only make honestly if we first acknowledge what we are choosing, what we are accepting, what we are becoming in the process. The lights can come back on now. Your Coca-Cola, if you're drinking one, sits there still, same as it was, same as it has always been. But perhaps it tastes different now. Perhaps you see it differently. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's where change begins. Good night.